By now, you should have finished reading or listening to the short story Big Things Come in Small Packages by Eleanora E. Tate. You are also supposed to try to think about what the theme might be. In order to do that, we need to recall what happened in the story. We're going to use a familiar tool to do just that. We're going to use the plot mountain. It's a way to help track the correct order of events in a story. Today, to review, we're going to use Doug's Cool Shoes from earlier this week. At the beginning of a plot mountain, we have what's called the Exposition. This is where we learn who the main characters are, what the setting is, and what the problem is that the characters are trying to solve. In Doug's Cool Shoes, there were plenty of characters. The two most important characters were, of course, Doug and Roger the villain. The cartoon took place in Bluffington, the town where Doug lives. The problem was that Doug wanted a new pair of shoes to try to impress the other kids in town. That's our exposition: character, setting, and conflict. Then we start moving up the plot mountain into the next and longest part of the story. This is called the rising action, and it's the part of the story where things become more difficult for the characters. The job of the rising action is to build the story up to the climax. Several things happen to Doug in this story before we reach the climax. Doug sees a commercial for expensive basketball shoes that he wants. While trying to buy them, he begins to feel guilty about getting rid of his old shoes. It turns out that Doug can't afford the shoes. To make things worse, Roger can afford them and makes sure to make Doug feel bad about it. But before leaving the mall, Doug meets Sky Davis, the famous basketball player, who gives him a pep talk about why he likes his own shoes. Then the story reaches its climax. This is supposed to be the most exciting part of a story. The rising action is supposed to bring the characters to this point. In the climax, the characters face and try to ultimately solve their main problem. In Doug's Cool Shoes, the climax is when Roger challenges Doug to a game of basketball in front of everyone. Roger has his new expensive shoes that he bought during the rising action. Doug is playing in his old shoes, the ones he felt guilty about in the rising action. Here in the climax, Doug wins the game when Roger's new shoes aren't as great as he thought they would be. Things move fast when we're on the other side of the plot mountain. We move toward the falling action. This is the opposite of rising action. Instead of things getting harder and more intense for the main character, things are calming down as the climax is now past. In the case of Doug's Cool Shoes, the falling action comes immediately after the climax basketball game. We find Doug writing in his journal as he tries to think of a nice way to phrase what he learned from his experience. We quickly fall down this side of the mountain to the resolution, which comes very quickly after the falling action. The resolution is the very end of the story. We may learn what happened to the characters or setting. It may even set up a sequel. The point is, the resolution is when the story is as over as it's going to be. In Doug's Cool Shoes, the resolution is when Doug finally thinks of a way to finish writing his journal entry. He has finally figured out what the experience taught him. Now that we've reviewed the plot mountain with a familiar story, be sure to open up the plot mountain assignment for Big Things Come in Small Packages and arrange the events into the proper order.